Hi, I'm Dr. Márcio Pereira, a neurosurgeon and neuroscientist, and I dedicate my work to studying how the human brain constructs emotions, bonds, and behavioral patterns that we rarely consciously perceive. Today, I want to talk about something that seems simple at first glance, but which hides one of the deepest conflicts of the human mind: habits that activate female emotional maturity. When people talk about emotional maturity, most imagine self-control, calmness, empathy, and the ability to communicate. Some think of it as knowing how to deal with feelings, while others associate it with the absence of emotional outbursts, patience, or social intelligence. This is the socially accepted version, a comfortable version, organized, seemingly logical. But this interpretation is superficial. From a neurological standpoint, emotional maturity doesn't stem from a conscious intention to be mature, nor from well-intentioned advice, nor from moral effort. It emerges from profound adaptations of the brain to repeated experiences of frustration, loss, limitation, and reconstruction. And it almost always develops from internal conflicts that the person would prefer not to face. What few people realize is that many of the behaviors labeled immature are not character flaws, but emotional survival strategies learned very early in life. The brain, especially the limbic system, quickly learns what it needs to do to avoid pain, rejection, or abandonment. And it keeps these patterns active for decades, even when they no longer make sense. In the case of women, this process is even more complex. From an early age, the female brain is exposed to a specific set of social, emotional, and symbolic pressures. There is a constant expectation of sensitivity, care, adaptation, and emotional interpretation of the environment. At the same time, there is a silent demand not to be too much, not to feel too much, not to demand too much, not to bother too much. This paradox creates a field of permanent tension within the nervous system. The result is not maturity, it's emotional vigilance. Many women learn to monitor their own behavior with almost clinical precision: their tone of voice, the other person's reaction, their own emotional intensity. The brain begins to operate in a state of anticipation, looking for signs of rejection or disapproval. Neurobiologically, this means a constantly activated amygdala prefrontal cortex axis, as if the social environment were unstable territory. And here arises the first great illusion. Society calls this maturity. But the brain knows it's just adaptation. True emotional maturity doesn't stem from repression, but from integration. It doesn't arise from the fear of losing connections, but from the ability to handle frustrations without collapsing internally. It doesn't manifest in constant silence, but in the coherence between what one feels, what one thinks, and what one chooses to do, even when that generates discomfort. The problem is that this type of maturity requires something rare: the willingness to abandon patterns that once guaranteed emotional security. And the brain resists that. He prefers the familiar to the healthy. He prefers the predictable to the true. He prefers to repeat a painful bond rather than face the emptiness of not knowing who he is without it. That's why many women, even intelligent, sensitive, and aware ones, remain trapped in emotional cycles they say they want to overcome, not out of weakness, but because the brain associates these patterns with emotional survival. Emotional maturity begins precisely at the point where this association starts to be questioned. And this is where the first habit emerges, the one that almost no one recognizes as such, but which defines everything else. A silent habit, invisible and deeply uncomfortable, the ability to tolerating emotional discomfort without seeking immediate relief. This is the first turning point. The human brain is designed to reduce tension. When faced with frustration, rejection, or insecurity, it quickly seeks something that restores a sense of control, a message, a justification, an impulsive reaction, a rationalization, a sudden withdrawal, or a premature emotional surrender. But each time this happens, the brain learns that it doesn't need to mature, it just needs to escape. Emotional maturity begins when this escape is interrupted, when a person can bear not responding immediately, when they endure anxiety without turning it into action, when they acknowledge their own need for validation without obeying it. Neurologically, this strengthens the prefrontal cortex, responsible for emotional regulation, and reduces the dominance of the amygdala, which governs fear and impulse. But this strengthening comes with something few are willing to experience: inner silence, doubt, and a temporary feeling of emptiness. This is the point where many back down, because emptiness is more frightening than known pain, and so the brain learns that it's better to continue as is. But what happens to a person who never goes through that stage? What forms within someone who confuses maturity with emotional control? And why are so many relationships, decisions, and life choices shaped by this silent confusion? That's what we need to examine now, because the next habit reveals something even more disturbing about how the female brain learns to love, to be silent, and to get lost without realizing it. There is a specific moment in emotional development when many women learn something that is never explicitly taught, but which becomes firmly ingrained in their nervous system: the idea that trusting one's own perception too much can be dangerous. This learning doesn't come from a single experience. It's built little by little through repeated small invalidations, a reaction minimized, a feeling treated as an exaggeration, an intuition dismissed as insecurity, a discomfort that finds no acceptance. Over time, the brain learns to do something sophisticated and profoundly dysfunctional. It begins to doubt its own internal signals. From a neurological point of view, this is crucial. Emotional perception arises from the integration between deep brain areas, such as the insula, responsible for bodily and emotional awareness, and the prefrontal cortex, which interprets and organizes these sensations. When this integration functions well, the person feels something, understands what they feel, and acts coherently. But when perception is repeatedly invalidated, the brain learns to break that circuit. The feeling arises, but it is quickly censored. Intuition appears, but it is muffled by a rational explanation. The discomfort manifests itself, but it is reinterpreted as exaggeration, deficiency, or fragility. This is the second silent habit: to systematically distrust one's own emotional interpretation of reality. Socially, this is often praised. The woman who doesn't create problems, who doesn't make a drama, who knows how to let things go, is seen as mature. But neurologically, what's happening is something else entirely: a continuous training in mild emotional dissociation. The brain learns that feeling too much is dangerous, that overreacting generates rejection, understanding too much threatens relationships. So he does what he knows best: he adapts. Gradually, the woman begins to outsource her own emotional decisions. She waits for external signs to validate what she feels. She observes the other person's behavior before trusting her own impression. She learns to read micro-expressions, changes in tone, subtle absences, not out of curiosity, but as a defense mechanism. This state of constant vigilance creates a profound paradox. On the one hand, she becomes highly perceptive. On the other, she loses confidence in her own perception. It's like having an extremely sensitive radar, but not believing what it picks up. And here a crucial point arises. This pattern doesn't stem from fragility, but from adaptive intelligence. The brain learns that to preserve bonds, it needs to adjust. The problem is that over time, this adaptation comes at a high price. The most common consequence is internal confusion. The person senses that something is wrong but cannot name it. They feel discomfort but cannot find a logical justification. They perceive contradictions in the other person but doubt themselves before questioning. This is the perfect breeding ground for unbalanced relationships. Because when someone learns to distrust their own perception, they become more susceptible to emotional manipulation, not necessarily intentional but structural. They begin to accept explanations that don't add up, to normalize absences, to reinterpret disinterest as tiredness, coldness as depth, instability as emotional complexity. At this point, the brain is no longer seeking clarity. It seeks stability, and for him, stability means predictability, even if it's painful. That's why so many women remain in relationships that don't nurture them, in dynamics that silence them, in roles that demand constant adaptation. Not because they don't perceive the problem, but because they've learned to doubt their own interpretation before doubting others. Emotional maturity begins precisely when this pattern is interrupted. When a person begins to observe what they feel without immediately invalidating it, when they accept discomfort as a legitimate fact, not as a personal failing. When you understand that maturity isn't about swallowing discomfort, it's about listening to it without rushing to justify it. But this movement generates intense internal conflict, because trusting one's own perception again means taking the risk of losing connections, disappointing expectations, and being seen as difficult, demanding, or cold. And the brain fears this deeply. The question that remains then is inevitable. What happens when a woman stops silencing her own perception but still doesn't know who she becomes when she starts listening to it? This is where the next habit emerges, perhaps the most uncomfortable of all, because it requires breaking with an identity built up over years, and almost no one is prepared for that. There is a crucial moment in emotional development when the brain needs to differentiate between two things that, for a long time, have been treated as synonyms: attachment and sacrifice. For many women, this distinction has never been clearly taught. From an early age, affection appears associated with renunciation. To love is to yield, to care is to endure. Maintaining relationships is learning to adapt continuously. Gradually, the brain registers a silent equation. The more I endure, the more mature I am. The more I can handle, the more value I have. This learning is not theoretical. It is emotional and neurological. The limbic system begins to associate suffering with connection. The presence of another person, even when it generates tension, activates circuits of belonging. And the momentary relief of not being alone releases enough dopamine to mask the progressive wear and tear. Over time, the brain learns something dangerous: to confuse emotional intensity with affective depth. Frequent arguments, constant insecurity, cycles of estrangement and reconciliation come to be interpreted as proof of love. The absence of conflict, on the other hand, can generate estrangement, boredom, or a feeling of emptiness, not because the bond is weak, but because the nervous system has been conditioned to chaos. This is one of the most delicate aspects of emotional maturity, because from a neurological point of view, the brain doesn't seek happiness, it seeks familiarity. If familiarity has always been accompanied by tension, the body begins to find tranquility strange. Stable relationships seem cold. Emotionally available people seem uninteresting. Predictability sounds like a threat, not security. This is where many women find themselves trapped in a painful paradox. They desire peace, but feel alive only in conflict. And that's not emotional weakness, it's conditioning. The brain associates emotional release with a feeling of connection. Each reconciliation after a crisis releases dopamine and oxytocin. Each gesture of affection after a period of distance seems more intense. The system learns that love comes after pain. But this logic comes at a profound cost. Over time, the body enters a state of chronic alert. The body never fully relaxes. Thoughts revolve around the other person. Identity begins to be shaped by the relationship. And what should be a bond becomes a field of constant emotional surveillance. It is at this point that emotional maturity begins to demand something radical: the ability to differentiate between love and attachment. Attachment is born from fear. Love is born from choice. Attachment needs constant confirmation. Love tolerates silence. Attachment feeds on insecurity. Love grows in stability. But for the brain that has learned to survive emotionally through stress, this difference is not obvious. On the contrary, it generates distress. Because abandoning the pattern of sacrifice means giving up an identity built over years. It means admitting that much pain wasn't proof of love, but ignored signs. It means recognizing that loyalty itself was used against oneself, and that's hard to accept. This is why so many women, even when aware of it, remain in cycles of excessive giving. Not because they don't know they are negating themselves, but because the brain still associates this behavior with emotional security. Breaking with this requires a new habit, one of the most difficult to develop: the habit of enduring the guilt that arises when one begins to set boundaries. Because when a woman stops sacrificing herself, something happens around her. People get annoyed, relationships change, expectations are shattered, and the brain, programmed to avoid rejection, reacts with alarm. This is the point where many back down. But those who go through this phase discover something unsettling. Emotional maturity doesn't bring immediate relief. First, it brings inner loneliness, a feeling of displacement, a strange silence. And that's precisely where the next habit begins to form. A habit that confronts the need to please, to be accepted, to be needed. A habit that requires confronting one's own autonomy and everything it threatens to destroy. There comes a point in emotional maturity where the greatest conflict ceases to be external and becomes internal. It is no longer the other person who threatens the balance, but change itself. When a woman begins to abandon the role of someone who always understands, forgives, adapts, and yields, something inevitable happens. Guilt arises. Not rational guilt, linked to a concrete mistake, but a diffuse, silent, almost physical guilt. A feeling of failing someone, even when there is nothing objectively wrong. This guilt does not stem from morality. It stems from the nervous system. The human brain, especially in affective contexts, learns to associate belonging with the maintenance of patterns. When these patterns change, the system interprets this as a risk of exclusion. And exclusion, for the primitive brain, has always meant a threat to survival. That's why saying no can cause tachycardia. That's why setting limits causes insomnia. That's why choosing oneself evokes a strange feeling of selfishness, even when it's absolutely necessary. From a neurological standpoint, this occurs because the prefrontal cortex, responsible for conscious decisions, conflicts with older structures, such as the amygdala and the social reward system. While reason understands the limit, the body reacts as if it were breaking a survival pact. And here lies one of the most difficult habits of emotional maturity, learning to remain in the discomfort of guilt without turning back. Most people can't stand this stage. They retreat. They apologize unnecessarily. They back down from the boundary. They resume their old role, all to restore the feeling of belonging. But in doing so, they reinforce the idea in the brain that autonomy itself is dangerous. Emotional maturity requires the opposite. It demands that the person remain firm while the body protests, that they accept the anxiety without turning it into action, that they allow the discomfort to exist until the nervous system learns something new, that it is possible to be accepted without self-annihilation. This learning is not intellectual, it's physiological. Over time, the brain begins to recalibrate its parameters. The amygdala reduces the threat response. The prefrontal cortex gains more control. The feeling of guilt diminishes. But this only happens if the person doesn't back down at the first sign of tension. This is where many women feel estranged from themselves. They no longer react as they once did. They no longer explain themselves as much. They no longer justify themselves at every moment. And this generates a feeling of detachment, not only from others but from their own former identity. A silent question arises: if I'm no longer the one who gives in, who am I now? This phase is often mistaken for coldness, arrogance, or indifference. But in reality, it's about emotional reorganization. The brain is learning a new pattern of functioning, less reactive, less dependent, more self-regulated. This is also where many relationships break down, not for lack of love, but because they were built upon a version of woman that no longer exists, a version that negated itself, that accepted more than it could handle, that confused affection with sacrifice. Emotional maturity comes at a price. She doesn't promise immediate comfort. She doesn't guarantee approval. She doesn't preserve relationships that depend on her lack of boundaries, but it offers something rare: internal coherence. And this consistency changes everything, because from that point on, the brain begins to operate from a new axis. No longer the fear of losing the other person, but the commitment not to lose oneself. And that's precisely what prepares the ground for the next habit, perhaps the most silent and at the same time the most transformative of all. A habit that redefines how women relate to time, desire, and their own future. There is an advanced point in emotional maturity where the brain begins to operate radically differently. It is no longer guided by urgency, nor by the fear of loss, nor by the need for immediate fulfillment. It is here that one of the rarest and least understood habits of female emotional maturity emerges, the ability to distinguish desire from need. At first glance, this seems simple, but neurologically, it's one of the most difficult separations to achieve. Desire originates from the dopaminergic system. It is fast, impulsive, and anticipatory. It projects future pleasure and pushes the body toward something that promises relief, connection, or validation. Need, on the other hand, arises from deeper layers, linked to emotional security, psychic integrity, and the sense of continuity of the self. The problem is that, for a brain conditioned by deprivation, the two become mixed up. The desire begins to seem urgent, need begins to seem like lack, and the absence of the other is felt as a threat. In this state, many emotional decisions are made not because they make sense, but because they alleviate anxiety. Replying to a message, resuming contact, accepting less than one deserves, staying where there is no reciprocity. All of this momentarily calms the nervous system, but reinforces a cycle of emotional dependence. Maturity begins when this logic is interrupted, when a woman learns to recognize her impulses without obeying them, when she acknowledges desire but doesn't confuse it with urgency, when she understands that not everything that calls out needs to be heeded. This requires a high level of emotional self-regulation, because when the brain doesn't receive the expected reward, it reacts. It produces restlessness, repetitive thoughts, fantasies, justifications. It tries to convince, it tries to rush, it tries to sabotage the silence. But it is precisely in this silence that something new is built. Gradually, the nervous system learns that it is possible to desire without acting, that it is possible to feel without getting lost, that it is possible to want something without submitting to it. This learning profoundly changes how a woman relates to time. She stops living her life according to the next gesture of the other person. She stops interpreting silences as automatic rejection. She stops looking for signs where there are no answers yet. And perhaps most importantly, she begins to choose more clearly, choosing not out of fear of being alone, not out of a need for validation, but out of internal alignment. This completely changes the dynamics of relationships, because when desire ceases to be a need, it becomes selective. The woman begins to perceive who adds value and who merely takes up space, who contributes and who only activates old patterns. And that changes everything. But this stage brings a powerful side effect: conscious loneliness. Not the loneliness of rejection, but the loneliness of someone who no longer accepts just any presence. A loneliness that is frightening at first, because it breaks with the habit of defining oneself based on others. This is where many people give up. They backtrack. They reactivate old contacts. They recreate bonds they already knew wouldn't work, all to escape the silence that this new phase imposes. But those who go through this stage discover something crucial. Emotional maturity doesn't eliminate desire, it refines it. And when that happens, the last habit emerges, the most discreet, the least talked about. And paradoxically, this is what most transforms the way a woman lives, chooses, and relates to others. A habit that doesn't depend on the other person or on the relationship, not even external validation. A habit that redefines the very axis of identity. There is an end point, and at the same time a new beginning, in the process of emotional maturity. It is not marked by euphoria, nor by a feeling of victory. Most of the time it arrives in silence. It is the moment when a woman stops organizing her own life based on the expectations of others. Not because he became indifferent, not because he stopped loving, but because the internal axis finally stabilized. From a neurological point of view, this is a rare stage. It arises when the brain no longer depends on external approval to regulate emotions, when the reward system stops responding excessively to validation, praise, or rejection, when identity ceases to fluctuate according to the reaction of the environment. This is where the last habit takes hold, the ability to live in a self-referential way. This doesn't mean selfishness. It means consistency. A woman who reaches this point no longer constantly asks herself if she's pleasing, if she's being enough, if she's exaggerating. she begins to ask herself something much simpler and much deeper. Does this make sense to me? This question changes everything, because it shifts the center of decision-making from fear to consciousness. The brain stops operating in defensive mode and begins to function in an integrated way. The prefrontal cortex takes command, the amygdala calms down, and emotions cease to be storms and become signals. At this stage, emotional maturity manifests itself in an almost invisible way. It appears in the way a woman reacts to silence, in the way she deals with frustrations. It depends on how you choose to stay and/or leave. There's no need for lengthy explanations. There's no longer any urgency to be understood. There's no desperation for recognition. There is a presence, and this presence changes the way the world responds. Interestingly, when a woman stops trying to be accepted, she begins to be respected. When she stops proving her worth, she begins to transmit it. When she stops chasing commitment, she begins to attract more aligned relationships. But that's not the goal. The true marker of emotional maturity is something else. It's when a woman realizes she no longer needs to internally violate herself to fit in anywhere, that she no longer needs to negotiate her boundaries to maintain affection, that she no longer needs to explain why she feels what she feels. She finally understands that emotional peace doesn't come from controlling the world, but from stopping the war against herself. And this understanding changes everything, because from that point on, choices cease to be reactive, bonds cease to be compensatory, life ceases to be a series of painful adjustments. The brain learns a new pattern, internal security. And when that happens, something silent takes hold. The woman doesn't become cold, she doesn't become distant, it doesn't become inaccessible, she becomes whole. And perhaps that is the most accurate definition of emotional maturity, not the absence of emotion, but the full presence of oneself. Most people go through their entire lives without ever reaching that point, not because of inability, but because she was never taught to look inward honestly. And perhaps by recognizing these habits, something has begun to move, not as an answer, not as a solution, but as a necessary inconvenience, because everything that transforms before liberating first destabilizes, and that feeling that something has been seen but not yet fully understood. This is precisely where true maturity begins.